Story 1. Okay, this is a little less dark than most comments here, but I thought I would share. I went to the zoo with some friends and my girlfriend. There was a huge aviary you could walk into and see all the little colorful birds. As we walked, we noticed a dispenser, where you could buy seeds and sugary water to feed the birds. We bought some, and it was all fun and games until my gut told me we had to leave. I took my girlfriend's hand and we left. 2 minutes later, our friends left as well, now covered in bird droppings. Story 2. I was at a party when a man pushed me against a wall. He said it was a joke, but I said no. I already had bad feelings about him and called my boyfriend to pick me up because I was drunk. My friends were at the party and did not want to leave. A week later, that man was arrested for rape. Story 3. I was taking the southbound Red Line in Chicago during winter a few years ago when 3 people wearing balaclavas entered my car, which was already quite full. 2 stood by one exit and the third stood by the other. I saw them scan the passengers in my peripheral vision. The man, standing alone, looked over at the other 2 and gave them an okay nod. I felt like something was about to happen, so I got off at the next stop and walked the rest of the way home. Fortunately, none of them stopped me when I passed, probably because other people were still on the train. About 10 minutes later, I received a notification from the citizen application reporting a robbery and shooting at the next station. When I passed the station on my walk back, I saw many police cars and an ambulance parked at the entrance. Story 4. My mom went through something like this. It was 2003. I was 12 and my sister was 10. My parents were planning a date night and were going to have us stay with our grandmother and great-grandmother for the night. At the last minute, my mother changed her mind. They rescheduled, and we all stayed home. That night, my grandmother's house burned down, killing my great-grandmother and severely injuring my grandmother and one of my uncles. If my sister and I had been there, we likely would have been in the same room as my great-grandmother or my grandmother, and one or both of us would have died. Story 5. One night I was waiting for the train when 4 men walked up and I immediately got a bad feeling. I had been robbed once before on the train, and their demeanor reminded me of the men who robbed me. They seemed to be sizing me up and were excited about it. I stood for a few more minutes reading my book and trying to look casual, then walked 3 or 4 car lengths down the platform. They stayed where they were but kept watching me. When the train arrived, I went to the front door of the car, glanced behind me, and saw them running down the platform toward me. I got into the car and moved toward the back doors at the opposite end. A few seconds later, the 4 men burst through the front doors and started looking around. I slipped out the back doors just as they were closing, before they spotted me, so I ended up safe on the platform while they were stuck on the train as it pulled away. When they looked out the window and saw me, they looked furious. I ran out of the station and took the bus instead. The next day, a news story reported that someone was robbed at knife point at the next stop around that time by 4 men who matched the description of the ones I had encountered. I am so glad I listened to my gut and removed myself from that situation. In hindsight, everything happened so fast, and it is incredible that I reacted in exactly the right way to get myself to safety. Story 6. It was not me. My then roommate was a janitor at a school. He usually left for work before I got up, so I was surprised to see him in the living room playing Xbox when I knew he had to work that day. Apparently, he had a terrible feeling that something would happen and called in sick. I thought he was being an idiot, but when the news later reported a school shooting with multiple casualties, I was stunned. I do not think science has any explanation for that. It would be one thing if he regularly slacked off and something happened on an off day, but I had never seen him miss work for any reason, let alone because of a bad feeling. Story 7. Not me, but my dog. I was having a small after-bar party at my apartment next door. Somehow, in a drunken shuffle, my friends disappeared and I was left with a man I did not know. He was being nice and we chatted while waiting for the others to come back. I offered him a drink and got one for myself. I thought he seemed odd, so I was texting my friends to hurry up. Then my sweet, timid but large dog started barking and growling at this man like I had never heard before or since. I told the man to get the hell out, and when he got irritated I said, "If the dog says you are out, you get out." He tried to argue, so I shouted him out. 10 minutes later, I hit the floor and crawled to the bathroom to vomit. I slept for hours, I never vomit when I drink, and I never get that drunk. I thought my drink had been in my sight all night, but I can only assume he slipped me something. My dog was 4 at the time and is now 11. I am so glad I listened, because his instincts definitely saved me from something awful. Story 8. I went to sleep earlier than normal because I had picked up an extra shift. One of my good friends pressured me to go with him to a party, but I couldn't bring myself to go. I needed sleep before a 12-hour shift. It turned out he had planned to kill us both in a murder-suicide. After leaving the party, he wrecked his car into a tree as his way out of this world. He survived, and his father found notebooks and poems describing how he had planned it and believed this was a way for us to live in the afterlife as brothers. We stopped talking after that. Story 9. Not me, but my husband. He used to work for a delivery company. One morning he had an unshakable feeling so strong that he could not bring himself to go to work. He kept saying something was off and that he was going to trust his gut. The man who covered his shift delivered to a house where he was attacked by 2 dogs. Dispatch did not notice that his vehicle had not moved for 6 hours. No one knew he was there, and by the time anyone came to check on him, he was too far gone to save. I still think about that. I feel so incredibly bad for the man and his family. At the same time, I am beyond grateful my husband did not go to work that day. It is a double-edged sword morally. My husband quit that company the next day after they sent a reminder email to the drivers about what happened. The message read, "Woof, woof. Remember to be mindful about our furry customers. They do not always know we are bringing them good things. I wish I were joking." Story 10. It was not exactly a leave now moment, but it felt similar. I was living in my parents' apartment. They were both asleep. They take medication to sleep. I was about to go to sleep as well, so I turned off my light. Something told me to open my door, so I did. I looked into the hallway and saw flickering lights on the wall. I thought that was strange and almost ignored it, but I decided to check. It turned out my mom had put a candle in a plastic cup on top of an antique dresser. It started a fire. The flames were about 2 feet high, and the living room was already filled with smoke. Luckily, I was able to put it out and wake my parents to air out the apartment. Sometimes I think that if I had decided to just go to sleep, my parents and I probably would have died in a house fire. Always trust your gut. Story 11. Years ago, I was hanging out with a couple of friends in the street. We decided to go to a club that night. When we started walking toward it, I got a strange gut feeling I could not understand or shake. I told my friends I was not in the mood to go clubbing and that they could go without me. They tried to convince me to go for a bit, but I refused. They gave up and suggested we hang out at a friend's house instead. Later that night, while we were still hanging out, the news reported a shootout at the club. It was apparently gang-related, and bystanders were critically wounded by stray bullets. I remember my friends looking at me with pale faces, and I was deeply moved. I had never experienced anything like that, and nothing similar has happened since. I am thankful I listened to the feeling and that my friends agreed to go somewhere else. Who knows what could have happened? Story 12. I used to be an altar server for the church my foster family attended. It was Catholic, very strict, in a small rural ranching town. The priest who had been there basically forever passed away. He was well into his 90s. They went through a few temporary priests before they got one who stayed longer. He was younger and seemed really interested in the youth of the church, trying to set up youth groups and similar activities. He became especially interested in foster kids and those living in group homes. Since my foster family was heavily involved with the church and I served often, he took a lot of notice of me. He kept trying to get me to have private Bible rap sessions with him and said he wanted to give me more personal guidance, claiming I needed it since I did not have the support of a biological family. He apparently said the same to other kids in similar situations. By that time, I had honed good instincts for people who were off, and this man set all my alarm bells ringing. I tried to be polite when others were around, but I made it clear to my foster parents that I would not tolerate being near him any more than necessary. There was no way I would be alone with him, and I would get violent if I needed to. They knew I meant it from previous incidents, so they never tried to force it. Many years later, after I was an adult, I found out from a furry comedian talk show called To the Ranting Griffin that the priest who had creeped me out had been arrested for the sexual assault at gunpoint of a little boy and for trying to hire someone to kill that child after the boy had told people what happened. Apparently, the man he tried to hire said he could not do it but knew someone who could, and he contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which set up a sting with an agent pretending to be available for hire. When the priest attempted to hire him, he was arrested. The church tried to cover it up, of course, and I believe the church is still there pretending nothing happened. I do not know his final sentence, but whatever it was, I hope he can never harm anyone again. I just wish he had never gotten the chance to hurt any child. Knowing that it was not me does not bring me relief because I know I would have made an entire Broadway musical out of it, whether people believed me or not, and that might have spared other children similar experiences. Maybe I would even have had a chance to go for his throat. My instincts that he was bad news, no matter how friendly he acted, were spot on. Story 13. I was at an after-party purely because my friend wanted to have sex with one of the men. I waited in the living room. It was initially full of people but dwindled to just 2 men and me. My friend had not yet emerged from the bedroom of the person she had hooked up with. It was fine for a while. Then I noticed a look between the two and everything seemed to move in slow motion for a moment. I dragged my friend off the man's bed and we left immediately. One of those men later served time for the sexual assault and murder of his girlfriend. Story 14. It was not an urgent departure. When I was in my final year of high school, I planned to return my books to the library a couple of towns away on Saturday. I told some friends so we could hang out afterward. On the morning of the trip, I did not want to get up, so I decided to go later. At that time, I was an early riser, and this was something I almost never did. I also loved going to the library. An hour later, some friends kept calling, and one was at my door. Apparently, the train I was supposed to take had derailed, and several people had died. Story 15. This was obvious in hindsight, but I was naive and tipsy when I was traveling alone as a 26-year-old woman in Lisbon after dinner. On my walk to my hostel, a man stopped me and said I looked familiar, asking where I was from. I was in a great mood, so we got to chatting. I noticed another man in the background with his hood up, pacing back and forth. When I made eye contact, he quickly looked away but kept lingering, and I realized I was about to be robbed. I politely cut the conversation short and continued on to my hostel. Story 16. At first I thought I was being weird, overly sensitive. I stopped by a small local grocery store because I needed milk and mayonnaise but did not want to go to my regular store, which was much busier and farther from my house. A man kept appearing at the end of the aisle I was in. Saying he looked at me in a creepy way would be an understatement. After 3 of those looks, I checked out and left. I saw him in the parking lot. He stood there watching me get in my car. I did not learn my lesson right away. I went back 2 more times for a single item, and each time that man was there. I was so unnerved I stopped going to that store. The look in his eyes was terrifying, as if he were devouring me with his stare. I did not think about him again until almost a year later when I saw him on television. He had just been arrested. His name was Gary Ridgway. He worked on the street I lived on about 5 blocks down. Gary Ridgway was the Green River Killer. Story 17. Not leave now, but more in the sense of just knowing it's a disaster. My mom had suffered from uncontrollably high blood pressure for as long as I can remember. In the last couple of years, it got really bad, like 270/120. One night I woke up. I thought I heard a thud, but I was not sure. Everything was dark and silent, and I turned over and tried to go back to sleep. Something would not let me. I got a bad feeling and got up. The hallway was empty, and I went to the bathroom at the end of it. It was pitch dark. I turned the light on in the bathroom and saw my mom on the floor. She was conscious, and I remember asking her why she did not use the light. In my half-asleep state, I thought she had just stumbled in the dark. She said she did not want to risk waking me up. She was thoughtful like that. She got up and went back to bed. I asked her if I should call the ambulance. I had called them often that last year. She said yes, I should. She had a massive heart attack and passed half an hour later, while I was waiting for the emergency responders who took their time to arrive. For a long time after, I kept thinking that if I had gone back to sleep like I wanted to, I would have found her on that cold tiled floor in the morning. Instead, she could tell me what she felt was important, and I will never forget her words. When death comes knocking at your door, your gut knows. Story 18. This account is about my father. He served in Vietnam from 1967 to 1969, with a brief respite in Germany between tours. On one occasion, his company had completed a patrol and was waiting near its landing zone pickup point for extraction the following morning. Despite having no enemy contact during the patrol, he ordered the entire company to move away from the landing zone, reset the perimeter, and redig hasty fighting positions about 1,000 meters from their initial location. Their former position was struck by mortar and artillery fire throughout the night, and my father is 100% convinced that had they remained there, his entire company would have been killed. Story 19. My dad ignored his instincts and almost died. He was in high school and worked at my grandfather's store when he wasn't at school. It was a Saturday during dove season, and he had the day off to go hunting, but when he woke up that morning, he knew something bad was going to happen. He called everyone who was supposed to work that day and asked if they also felt like something was wrong and if they wanted him to take their shift. For some reason, he assumed the bad thing would happen to someone else. Everyone told him he was being silly and to calm down and enjoy his day off. So he packed his truck, grabbed his dog, and headed off. On the drive to the hunting area, his dog broke out of the carrier in the back of his double cab pickup and jumped into his lap while he was driving. He ended up going off the road at 75 miles per hour and hit a tree. His skull had multiple fractures, his nose was crushed into his sinuses, his left eye was dislocated from the socket and hanging out, and he also had multiple broken ribs. He somehow, I guess from shock, managed to get himself out of the wreckage and dragged himself to a nearby house. He was very lucky there was one, since it is a very rural area, and he almost gave a nice old lady a heart attack. She tried to get him into the house, but she had white carpet and my dad thought he was going to die anyway. So he refused to ruin her floor and passed out on her front porch. He then woke up in the hospital to a surgeon pulling a sheet off his face and saying, "I can't do anything for him," before walking away. What the surgeon meant was, "I'm not a plastic surgeon and he needs extensive facial reconstruction, so I can't do that." But what my dad thought was, "I'm going to die." The next time he woke up, he was in a different hospital where they sent him into surgery and mostly fixed his face. He's all right now for the most part. He has some scars, but nothing too severe. That's my opinion. I had friends growing up who refused to come to my house because my dad's face scared them. But I really don't see what is so scary. Maybe because I grew up with him, he just looks normal to me. He does look different from how he used to. I don't look much like his current face, but I look very similar to a picture of him at 17, right before the accident. Story 20. I was in my science class writing notes and watching an experiment. I had a feeling I should move to another part of the table, so I did. A couple of minutes later, the spot where I had been standing exploded into flame. The gas tap had been leaking, and the gas cloud reached the Bunsen burner we had lit. Since no one was there, it was harmless, and we continued the lesson after the teacher turned off the gas. Our science teacher never trusted our group with an open flame again. Story 21. Reading all these comments makes me worried I will never trust my instincts because I have anxiety. It incorrectly tells me there is danger everywhere, so I have learned to ignore it. Story 22. I was sitting in an otherwise empty living room at a house party after most of the guests had left and everyone else was upstairs. Two men sat on either side of me. One was the host, whom I had not met, and the other was his friend, the older brother of a high school friend who clearly did not know me. They chatted and were friendly. The host offered me marijuana and started telling me about his recording studio in the basement, offering to show me. I said maybe later, but he and his friend were persistent. I suddenly felt very uncomfortable, told them I needed to use the washroom, and ran upstairs to find my other friends. They were ready to leave, so I went with them. As I headed for the door, the two men asked if I was leaving. I said yes and left, and they looked disappointed and confused. At the time I thought I was being paranoid, but weeks later an ex told me the host was a known creep who preyed on young women, offering them drugs and studio tours, then assaulting and raping them after getting them alone. Story 23. I was near the front at a music festival 25 years ago. It was my first big festival, and I was there with my schoolmates with no adults present. The previous band was still playing on the adjacent stage as the headlining band was preparing to start. I began to feel the crowd was different, and I did not like it. There was more shoving and physicality. I had experienced much worse earlier in the day, but there was something else I could not describe, and my head was screaming to get out. I was only a few rows from the front barricade, so I quickly and loudly asked to be helped over the barricade and out the side, then watched the set from the back of the crowd. Tragically, things worsened as the set progressed. Although the band paused and tried to calm the crowd, a teenage girl later died in hospital after being caught in the crush. Rest in peace, Jess. Story 24. One of my friends was having issues with her roommate, who was unstable and nitpicky. I always thought the roommate was loud, didn't do chores, and was generally a bad roommate, but I didn't expect anything worse. We were hanging out when the roommate came home and seemed silently angry. Usually she was loud and nitpicky, but that night she wasn't. She walked past the room where we were playing games and stared at us for a bit before walking away. I immediately felt uneasy and told my friend we should go somewhere else to give her space. My friend said she was too tired and was just going to take a nap. I told her she should lock her door, and she did as I was leaving. Later that night, I got a text that a fight had broken out between the roommates and that my friend had called the police. Her text stopped after that. The next day, I found out that my friend had tried to break up the fight and was stabbed to death. I still can't believe I didn't push her harder to leave when I felt the vibe was off. She didn't deserve to die. Story 25. I was out at the clubs on Halloween night. It was around 1 a.m. when my partner and our family and friends decided to head out. Before we left, we walked a little down the club strip and back. There were many costumes to see, and the street had a variety of stores, tattoo shops, clubs, bars, and restaurants open. My partner asked whether we should walk the other way or just go home. For some reason, when I looked at the street, I thought, this would be a great place for a shooting. Big crowds and nowhere to run. That random thought gave me chills, so I insisted we leave. They did. Not really want to go, but I told them I had a bad feeling. We got an Uber within 5 minutes. As we were driving away, we passed several police cars with lights and sirens on, speeding toward the strip of clubs. We ended up eating pizza and falling asleep around 4 a.m. When we woke the next day, our phones were filled with missed texts and calls because we had just missed a shooting. We had posted to social media about being at the club where the shooting happened, in front of the club we had gone to. We had left around 1:40 a.m., and the shooting happened about 1:47 a.m. Such a bizarre thought to have, but it ended up saving us. I remember several people were shot, and I think 3 were critically wounded. Then the shooter and 1 other person were dead. We missed it by minutes. It was insane. Story 26. I was going to get on a bus to hang out with friends, but my gut told me something was wrong. So I went back home. The bus was in an accident and several people were injured. Story 27. Back when I was in high school, my mom told me to take a day off because I would be going dress shopping with my uncle. He insisted on buying me a bridesmaid dress because my sisters and I were going to be bridesmaids in his wedding the following day. My sisters went to school, and my uncle picked me up to go to JCPenney at the mall. At first, everything was fine. I quickly picked out a dress and expected him to drop me off at home afterward. He was very emotional, saying how excited he was to get married. After we left the mall, he said he needed to go to my grandparents' house and then pick up a friend from the airport, listing a bunch of other errands. I felt uncomfortable because that was not what I had agreed to, and my gut told me I needed to get to my grandparents' house as soon as possible. I expected we would stop there first, but he kept stopping at random places and meeting random people while I stayed in the car on high alert. He smoked more marijuana and began driving erratically, going on tangents about whatever came to mind. I was tired and wanted out, so I kept asserting that we needed to go to my grandparents' house and to drop me off there. We eventually went, and I immediately felt so much safer. Later that night, my grandparents got a call from the police saying he had been at a mall near their house, suffered a mental break, and had started panicking, yelling, and waving a knife, frightening people nearby. Thankfully, he did not harm himself or others. He was admitted to a nearby mental hospital, had to reschedule the wedding for a couple of months. and his fiancée and everyone else were very concerned for him. I am grateful I listened to my gut and that I was assertive enough to get out of that situation that day. Story 28. I finished a workout at the gym with my then abusive boyfriend. I decided that day to change the status quo. Instead of going to his truck for our post-training meal and conversation, I stopped at my car and told him I was going home. He asked a few times to talk first, and I refused to go to his truck. We sat in my car and chatted for about 3 minutes when we heard a loud screech and crash. We could not see what was happening, but we saw many people running toward his truck. An elderly woman accidentally pressed the accelerator instead of the brake and drove her vehicle through his truck and another car, destroying the rear left of the car and the right middle to front of his truck. She also wedged the front left of his truck under the front right of the truck parked on the other side and managed to push all three onto the walkway from curb height. The other truck smashed into a concrete planter. She was perfectly fine, for cars were totaled. Where I would have been sitting had I followed the usual routine was crushed up to the engine. I would have died. Story 29. This one fits the category but is different from the rest. Many years ago, I was in New Orleans with friends, eating beignets at Café du Monde, when a television film crew came to do a piece and filmed us in a brief, funny interaction. The director was my age, attractive, down-to-earth, and had a great sense of humor. So I was delighted when he invited me to meet up that night for a drink. I accepted and we had a great time. I liked him. There were no creepy vibes. He invited me back to his place in a way that felt comfortable and sweet, but I declined and went home even though I wanted to get to know him. It felt random and strange to say no, but I felt I should return to the hotel I was sharing with friends, so I did. He was cool about it and drove me back without trying to make a move. I do not understand my actions, but I felt overwhelmingly that this was right, so I drifted off to sleep. An hour or two later, I woke with severe food poisoning, which my two friends also had. Thus began a vile night of the three of us vomiting and having severe diarrhea for hours with only one toilet between us. The three of us are like family and still laugh about it, but had I gone home with him, he would have been stuck taking care of me all night. It was so bad he could not even have driven me home once it started. I did not feel sick when I said no, and all his vibes were genuinely great. It felt random but also clear that I should say no, and this instinct saved him, not just me, from a horror show he did not deserve. I am sure he wondered what he did wrong, nothing, but he had no idea how lucky he was that I followed my gut before I had any physical clue that it would betray me. Story 30. I went on a first date with a very attractive woman and everything was going great. Nothing about the date seemed strange. We went back to her place and were about to hook up when, for some reason, I suddenly felt I needed to leave. Couldn't tell you why. It was the strangest feeling, especially since I really wanted to hook up. I got off the couch, told her it had been an amazing date, and left. At that point, I would probably have agreed to a second date and assumed it was just a weird vibe. The next day, she called. During the conversation, she asked whether we were now a couple, asking directly if we were boyfriend and girlfriend. I started laughing because I thought it was a joke. She began crying and asked why we couldn't just be together, then started screaming that I always do this to her. She said almost verbatim, "Why do you always do this to me? I'm so tired of you doing this. Why can't we just be together?" She then texted me, calling me the biggest piece of shit she'd ever met, the worst boyfriend ever, and said she would warn other women never to date me. All I could think was that this could turn into a murder-suicide. I had known her for less than 24 hours. Note: I know this was just a bad date, but nothing about it suggested she was unstable or explained why I immediately felt I had to leave. Story 31. I was working at home with the blinds open. Some light rain was coming through, but I was deep into a project. I had my headphones on and didn't think anything of the rain. 1 minute it was fine. The next I glanced toward the window and it was completely white. For half a second I was confused and saw a gray blob dancing in it. My stomach dropped and I had an instant feeling to get away from the window. I jumped up and ran to the bathroom. It turned out the gray blob was a huge tree. Story 32. I was at my college eating lunch before my next class. I had planned to sit outside across from the cafe, but I changed my mind for no particular reason. That day, a shooting between students started exactly where I would have been sitting. Story 33. When I was depressed and working 3 jobs to afford my studio apartment in California, I came across a young man one night who said he had taken too many psychedelic mushrooms and got separated from his friends. He asked to use my phone to call or check his location. I told him I was in the middle of an order and that if he stayed put I could even take him home. He seemed harmless. Skinny, wearing a turtleneck with a funny accent, and genuinely embarrassed to be in the situation. I ended up coming back for him 20 minutes later and he was gone. I ran into him a few streets down, and when I offered help he said he was sobering up and had found his way home. He asked if I smoked. I said I did and he offered to smoke me out. I knew I shouldn't, but I was depressed and lonely, so I agreed. The first red flag was that he didn't have a lighter. He said his house was down the street and he had one there. At his house, we talked about a variety of topics while smoking a couple of joints. He discussed religion, saying he had been spiritual, gone satanic, and was now all over the place. He bragged about his wealth, showed me very expensive clothes, including a pair of jeans that cost $8,000, and claimed his family sold weapons to many countries and that he wasn't worried about being caught. He mentioned it was not actually his place but a friend's, and no one else was home. He kept rambling about how he had been everywhere and had more money than he knew what to do with. He said more and more crazy things, but the last thing he said was so shocking I forgot some of what came before. In the empty house, casually he said, "I've even killed people just to know what it feels like." To prove he was serious, he threw a pair of shoes worth hundreds of dollars against the wall and used a marker to deface the $8,000 jeans. While he was doing this, I checked the doors to see if they were locked so I could get out before he hurt me or ruin more of his things. I stood up, said, "Okay, that might be enough for me tonight," and hightailed it to the door. He asked if he had said something wrong or if he had spooked me. Without looking back, I told him he had. Once the door was open and there was distance between us, I felt safe enough to turn around and ask, "Have you ever thought about therapy?" No lie, he answered. "No, why?" I later found out the homes he took me to were usually for people with mental illness, where clients and caretakers live together. Overall, a really weird night. Story 34. My car broke down in my hometown while my parents were away. I posted on Facebook asking if anyone could give me a lift. The first message I got was from a man called George, a friend of a colleague. At that time, I was 20. My work colleague was in his late 30s and an eccentric man with 2 doctorates in chemistry. He brewed his own moonshine, built his own armor, and so on. Lots of people called him weird, but we got on perfectly and often hung out at the same pub on weekends. He introduced my friends and me to George one weekend at the pub and jokingly said, "And people think I'm weird. Just be nice to him. I think he's had a tough time." From the moment I saw George, the first got more than weird vibes. We all know a socially awkward person who has been bullied and teased their whole life, but I didn't sense that about George. I didn't feel empathy. I felt scared. George proceeded to be a bit awkward and to overstep conversations with people. They mostly ignored it or joked and moved on. I tried to do some digging and told my colleague I couldn't find him on Facebook. He replied, "Oh, he doesn't like to be looked up, but I'm sure he wouldn't mind sharing his profile with you. He likes you." George had a completely random name, a hidden profile with few friends. I left it. He sent me a friend request a few days later and I accepted. On the day George offered me a lift, I politely declined and said someone else was coming to help. He offered to help with the car and to give me lifts in future, but I thanked him and said I'd let him know. A couple of weeks later, my colleague was distant with me. I had no idea what happened. He stopped talking to me, our lunch outings ended, I was being blanked in the lab, and he wouldn't even make eye contact. I confronted him a few days later asking what was wrong. I was honestly worried I had said something out of line when I was drunk at the pub. He then said we needed to meet outside of work to talk. We went to a pub at the weekend, and he sat there saying, "I'm so sorry. I'm so upset with myself. Why couldn't I tell?" He then told me that George was not George at all. He was a convicted pedophile who had moved down from the north of England to try to escape further grooming and kidnapping charges. He was not allowed on Facebook as part of his sentence terms. He had vanished a few days after offering me a lift, and the police came to my colleague's door asking questions. My colleague was so filled with guilt and shame that he did not realize something was off. I'm sure I was too old for this man at 20, but I am a 5-foot-tall woman who is not big or strong. I think back to that day a lot and wonder what would have happened if I had accepted the lift, or if any of my friends had been nice and ended up in a bad situation. Story 35. When I had just turned 7, my family and I were visiting extended family in Scotland. It was 1982 and we had traveled from New Zealand. Back then children were largely free range. I had gone down the road by myself to the local shops and was followed on the way back by a man. He gave off a deeply malevolent feeling despite doing nothing but walk behind me. I have always remembered that so strongly. I ran down the alley behind my aunt and uncle's house to hide because I did not want to get caught at the front door where I might have to wait for someone to open it. Years later, I saw an image of a man on an online news site. I think it was around 2010. I recognized that man as Peter Tobin, a convicted serial killer and sex offender. He was familiar with the area of Glasgow where we had been staying and has been alleged to be connected to a pedophile ring. Story 36. When I was a kid, I wanted my dad to take me to school on his motorcycle. He usually allowed it, but that day he refused and wanted to use the car instead. On the way, a swarm of wasps crossed in front of us, like a whole nest in flight. I had never seen a swarm before. If we had been on the motorcycle that day, I was certain we would have had an accident, because the wasps were splattered all over the car windshield. Story 37. I was finishing receptacles in a bank with my boss. There were heating, ventilation, and air conditioning workers and drywall workers there too. They had brought furniture in, and one drywall worker kept setting his dirty, heavy work bag on the brand new desk. This is a huge no-no if you know you know, and the general contractor politely asked him to move his bag. The worker complied but made a big deal about it. Nothing else happened until right before lunch. I started feeling really strange, hot and itchy all over. My heart rate was through the roof, and I had to get out of the building. I thought I was having a panic attack and asked my boss to come with me. He looked at me strangely but did. The second we stepped out the front door, we saw the drywall worker throw a float at the general contractor and start screaming. They had a violent fight, throwing things and smashing each other against the walls. The police were called. My boss thanked me and wanted to know how I had known. I said I did not know, I just had a feeling. Story 38. Was at a bar when an older man unexpectedly asked if I had a tracker in my car. I laughed and asked if I looked like I had a tracker, thinking he meant being followed by the police. He replied yes in a deadpan voice. I realized he was probably checking whether I was an easy carjacking victim. I finished my drink and left, and he started following me. When I reached my car, I noticed him standing there, looking straight ahead rather than at me. The timing felt eerie. I slipped around the side of the building and disappeared into the night, waited at a bar across the street for half an hour, then brought someone with me to walk back to my car. The man was gone. I wish I knew what happened to him. Story 39. At work, I send my coworkers to book fairs in different cities around the country. One day, I set everything up to send one of our best-selling authors to a very distant place. I live in Russia, so distant here means about a 5-hour flight. I only needed to book a flight and a hotel for her. When I was about to click the buy button, I felt horribly scared and nauseous. Doing this felt like putting her in danger. I decided to cancel the trip and my publishing house's participation in the fair. My coworker and my boss were very angry, and it was difficult to explain that something was wrong with the trip. A month later, my boss and another coworker were arrested on the day that author was supposed to fly to the fair. At that moment, I was at another fair. It was a horrifying experience. The whole crew feared more arrests and were sure someone else would be taken soon. None of us slept for 2 days. I was terrified being stuck so far from home. I was glad I could at least save my coworker from that experience. They are still detained. They have been accused of selling extremist literature. In Russia, anything related to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people is now considered extremist. They will probably be sent to prison for about 10 years. 10 years for selling young adult books. Fuck Putin. Story 40. When I was 5 years old, my country was at war, and it was not uncommon for explosive or incendiary attacks to strike civilian buildings. One day, while I was playing in my bedroom, I felt a sensation that was hard to describe, perhaps impending doom. My blood felt cold and my stomach was in knots. I could not resist the inexplicable urge to leave the room immediately. I walked into the kitchen where my mother was, and when I stepped out, an explosion shattered the windows just above where I had been playing. Story 41. I was camping as a child with my parents, my younger brother, and family friends. We were sitting around the fire after breakfast when my brother suddenly stood up and walked to the other side of the fire without saying a word. Not 5 minutes later, a portion of a branch from a large overhead gum tree snapped off and embedded itself in the ground exactly where he had been sitting. We were all so rattled that we immediately began packing up camp and went home days early. Story 42. When I was 13, my aunt took me to the beach. It was later in the day and pretty empty, just the two of us. Not too far out, I found a sandbar. The water went from knee-deep to suddenly too deep to touch the ground. I went out further and found a second sandbar where I could touch the ground again. I kept diving under the water trying to feel for sand dollars when I noticed a faint buzzing that grew louder. There were no boats, and I could only hear it when my head was underwater. It sounded like something big was right next to me. It started to weird me out, so I looked back at my aunt, who was standing next to two other people, frantically waving and screaming. I couldn't hear what they were saying. I just knew right then and there, don't splash, don't panic, and move slowly. I tried to keep the pace of walking back even when my feet couldn't touch the ground. The buzzing turned out to be sharks circling me. Two joggers noticed the fins and told my aunt they weren't dolphins and that they were getting closer. My aunt was angry I took so long to get out, but I told her I felt it would have been an awful idea to start kicking and splashing, and something was telling me to go as slowly as possible. Story 43. One time, before Lyft or Uber existed, I was out at the bars with friends. We realized we did not have much cash between us and the taxis in my town did not take cards yet. Our first stop was at a friend's house. I gave all my cash to a female friend so she could get home. I figured I was safe because his female roommate was home, and I could walk the 2.5 miles to my house if I got uncomfortable. I walked into his house to hang out for a bit and possibly crash on the couch, but his roommate was already asleep in her room. I already had a bad gut feeling, but I thought I would sleep on the couch for a bit before heading home. It was winter and I had lost my coat at the first bar, so I was not eager to walk. I headed toward the couch and he cut me off, saying, "You can sleep in my bed. It will be comfier." I said, "No, I'm good." He kept insisting and never once offered to take the couch himself, which would have been more convincing of good intent. I trusted my gut, turned, and left the apartment, saying, "Good night, thanks for the offer." I started walking and felt good about my decision when I suddenly saw myself in the headlights of a car. He was driving to get me and shouting that I should just sleep over. I started running across the apartment complex parking lot to get away, but he followed in his car, still driving fast. I panicked and ran across a grassy lawn, but it was dark and I did not see a 10-foot retaining wall. I ran off the edge and landed on the middle yellow line of the road below. The impact snapped my purse off its chain and shattered my phone screen. My tailbone felt like fire and my wrists were in pain. I sat on the road for a second to catch my breath, then saw his headlights turning out of the apartment complex driveway a bit up the road. I crawled off the road on my hands and knees, got into the fairway of a golf course, and hid behind some bushes until he gave up and went home. I continued my 2.5-mile walk home in the dark on a cold 28-degree night with a broken phone and a broken tailbone, wearing only a tank top and leggings. Because my phone screen was broken, I had to guess where the buttons were to call my then-boyfriend. When I finally called, I asked him to pick me up because I had been injured. He said, "No, I'm mad at you because you have not checked in all night." I explained that I had put my phone away in my purse because I had already lost my sunglasses and coat at the bar. I do not have a drinking problem, but I do have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I begged him to be mad at me tomorrow, but please come get me tonight. He refused. I made it home and shivered under multiple blankets on my couch for 2 hours before finally falling asleep. In the morning, he tried to make me breakfast and act like nothing had happened. Needless to say, I ended up breaking up with him. Story 44. It was not so much leave now as get away from them. This was around 2001. My husband and I were living in a small tourist town, and one morning we got a call to say his grandmother had unexpectedly died. Because where we were living was small and remote, we could not afford to fly to the funeral, so we made an elaborate plan. Drive 6 hours to the nearest city, meet my sister-in-law who lived there. All three of us take a cheap flight to the other island where we would meet her husband and my father-in-law, and then drive 8 hours to the small town where the funeral was. I had a long day at work and got home late. I wanted us to sleep and leave early. Our flight was at midday. I did not want to drive at night. My husband persuaded me to go, saying he would do all the driving. So we left at almost 10 p.m. I got very sleepy, so partway along, maybe about 3 hours in, I tried lying down in the back seat for a nap. It did not work, so I sat up again. That was when I saw a pair of headlights behind us. They were not speeding or driving erratically, but when I saw them I had a huge sense of fear. I did not want that car near me. I was this close to unbuckling and scrambling into the front seat. That car gave me the creeps. Eventually they passed us and the feeling went away instantly. We pulled over and I got back into the front seat. No longer scared, I felt fine. Right up until about 20 minutes later when we came across that car crashed into a bridge. One of the two men had been thrown into the middle of the road. We stopped, called the paramedics, and performed CPR, but both died. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.